Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Carl. Welcome to Politics in Perspective. I think we have a great show today. We have an extended interview with Devon Archer, of course, of the Biden family brand fame. We're going to see the life that he went through and his thoughts on where we are in America today, which I think is different from what you've seen before. But our first segment, and here today, we want to talk about, well, what's everybody on earth talking about? Tariffs. Where we are with this, where are we going with this, and what it all means. So let's just get right to it because there's so much to talk about. Let's first talk about some facts versus some myths. Fact: who pays tariffs? The actual check written is by American importers, or if there's a tariff that America pays, the importer in China or the importer in America. Right now, that importer may or may not pass that along. You saw Walmart this week squeeze its Chinese suppliers, saying, "Don't dare raise prices because you got a tariff. We want to keep prices lower." But the actual check is written by whoever imports it into the America. So the company on the American shore does that. Keep this in mind. The United States has always had tariffs. The American government collected tariffs originally. They didn't want sales tax. Give me liberty or give me death was in effect a sales tax. That's what started or gave fire to the American Revolution. But we used tariffs because we were a country along the ocean. Ships came in, and the importers there paid the tax, resold the goods. That was our system, right? It was our principal system all the way up until the income tax was instituted. Worst thing in American history, some people will say, but that was the system. All right. Now, there's this confusion out there, and I wrote a piece. Why did I write this piece? There seems to be this notion out there that somehow we got rich off of tariffs, or that the American system got rich because of tariffs. That's simply not true, and I hope you'll go to Substack, or you can pick it up at politicalvanguard.com. America was rich because we had very few taxes during the 1800s and 1700s, 1800s, and the early 1900s, or the first half. We had almost no tax. And also, we had no regulations. Literally, the first American federal regulation didn't come into the late 1800s with railroads. I mean, I want you to think about that, because regulations today are 10 to 12 billion dollars in cost a year. All the way up into the late 1800s, we had no regulations at all. It wasn't until the railroads. In fact, it wasn't until the 1930s that the first register of federal regulations was published. I want you to think about that. For the first 150 years, there was no federal register of regulations. Now it's a massive book that no one can even understand, and it costs 12. So how did we become rich? We became rich as a nation because of the absence of government, because of how few taxes were collected. Government was small, regulations were minimal, and taxes were minimal. That's how we became rich. We didn't become rich because of tariffs. Now, free trade, what does that mean? Well, based on what I just told you, it's the absence. It's the absence of tariffs. Now, free trade has never really happened on Earth on a long-term basis. It did happen in Singapore. They had no taxes on that island when it first started. They had no tariffs. And now they do today, but they have the highest GDP per person in the world. They too have tariffs. The point is, though, that the less taxes and regulations you have, the more likely you're going to have an enormous business. That's the American story, Singapore, the world. High tariffs, high taxes in any form, high regulatory taxes in any form, reduce business output. America is in trouble today because of how much we tax and spend. Spending is a form of taxation. You either pay for it in taxes or you pay for it in inflation and future debt. America has growth today only in the 2% range because we have so many taxes, so many regulations, so much spending. So the idea of free trade is to get those taxes, tariffs down as low as possible, because that will allow people to prosper. That should be the goal. Now, why do nations use it? America did it early on because it wanted to protect its manufacturing sector against the bigger industrial empire of England. That was the excuse. Milton Friedman and others have talked about how it was the wrong thing to do then, it's the wrong thing to do now. But that's why politicians do it. They respond to domestic concerns about domestic industry. And in politics, you respond to your constituencies, and the constituency says, in developing countries, we can't compete against the big boys, so protect us. And politicians respond. It doesn't mean it's the best thing, doesn't mean it's the best thing for consumers. Indeed, when you protect a domestic industry, they tend to raise prices more than if they were subject to competition. But that's why nations use it. Why is Trump doing this? And that's really the whole story of where we are today and why this all matters, right? But the important thing to know first is how we got in this mess, because we have a lack of manufacturing in this country. Why did that occur? Did it occur because China has tariffs, or Vietnam, or England, or Europe? No. We got in this mess because of what I told you before. Regulations, if they were their own industry, would be in the top 4 industries in America. It would be government, it would be healthcare, and in that same top tier is the cost of regulations. The cost of doing business in the United States has driven investment out of the United States. The cost of getting a new drug in the United States drove companies like Abbott Labs to Ireland and into Europe. We are in this mix, not because of the tariffs or the absence of tariffs. We are in this mix because it costs too damn much to do business in the United States. And until we lower that cost, we're always going to be in this mix. So don't believe that tariffs is your savior. Now, why is Trump doing this? Well, America does live in a world where the rest of the world is trying to protect itself from the American behemoth, because we're more productive, our products are better made than China's and other places, and they're trying to protect their domestic industries. That's normal in history. Why does this matter? Trump is using America's economic power to negotiate down those tariffs so that Americans can do better. That's point 1 of what he's doing. Point 2 is he wants to bring manufacturing back here. Look, we can't live in a international world of intrigue and not have chip making here, computer chips, not have rare earth minerals, not have steel manufacturing, and some of these other things. They're absolutely necessary for national security. If his goal is to reduce tariffs worldwide, he will go down in history as doing one of the most important things for prosperity. If his goal is simply to have tariffs, economically that won't work out in the long run. But from everything I understand and the people I know, his goal, as this tweet from Bill Ackman points out, is that he's going to negotiate down tariffs. If he does that, he'll be wildly successful and the world will thank him for it. But next up on Politics in Perspective, we're going to talk to Devon Archer in an extended interview about what he learned, how he got there, and what that says for America's future. Thanks so much for tuning in to Politics in Perspective. Well, everyone, welcome back to Politics in Perspective. I'm Tom Del Beccaro, and today we're joined by a very interesting guest, someone who has a perspective that very few people in the United States history has ever had. He's come from one side of the story to the other. He's lived through a lot. And so let's everyone welcome Devon Archer to the program. Devon, how are you?
Good, thanks, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to have you because I think, like I said, you have an interesting perspective. Now, look, if the average person just looks you up, they find out you're quote an American businessman and entrepreneur, and the founding board member of BHR Partners, which of course was that Chinese investment company. So that's
Correct.
the that's right off the top. But what I want to know is, oh, and you of course were on the board of Burisma, right?
That
What
is
I
correct.
want to know is how a kid from Glenhead, and I got to tell you something, you may not know this, but I grew up in Glen Cove.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
So we're what, 20 blocks from each
Yeah,
other? I mean, how far away?
bordering town, absolutely. Carvel was a
So,
very important part of my childhood, the Glen Cove Carvel.
right? Hello? So if we could just start off with how's a kid from Glenhead get to the heights that you did? Maybe give people a little insight into your background.
Yeah, okay. I'll keep it short. There's a lot out there, but really listen, when I went to North Shore, went to Glenwood Landing Elementary School. I was born in Seacliff, Long Island. I would say my grandfather on my father's side went to Seacliff High School, which eventually became North Shore High School. They came over from, and I won't go back this far. I promise I'll speed it up. But they came over from Birmingham, England, for Augustus Archer to attend McGill University in 1899. So they were in and around the Peaky Blinders, is our claim to fame. Moved to Canada. Seacliff was a summer town. They moved down to Seacliff, and been there through three generations. I ended up at go to Glenwood Elementary School, which is the Seacliff is an elementary school there that I'm sure you're very familiar with. Glen Cove was one of our rivals. And as a young man, always prided myself on winning field day and trying to be the best kind of athlete and student that I could be. I think that was instilled in from my parents. My grandfather was an artist who actually went to Yale, and but we're certainly kind of middle class, very very standard, as you know, from the area, but just focused on academics, focused on sports. North Shore was a very small, school. I graduated with 135 kids. One of them was my wife, also my high school sweetheart, and was fortunate enough, to be, have the grades and be good enough at lacrosse. I led Long Island in goals, I think, in 1992.
There you
Um,
go.
yeah, so there you go. It's in the record books. And was recruited by a couple of the Ivies. Obviously, my Yale was close to my heart. My dad had taken me to the Yale Harvard game when I was I think like 13 or 14, and he said, if you get on honor roll, I'll take you on a skiing trip every year, and you can come to Yale. And so it's just kind of, it's one of those those random trips up to New Haven. And he said, Grandpa went here, and that was the goal. So I applied early and withdrew every other application. There really wasn't another choice. Got to Yale. Was in Timothy Dwight Residential College. Had my first captain's practice. My parents dropped me off, and I was picked up, by one of the other, or a couple of the other players, and headed directly. Didn't even stay in New Haven that night. Headed directly to Nantucket, which I didn't even know where it was, and I think four of the eight people there were major brands in the American economy. So from Heinz to Goodyear to the Van Wicks of the Van Wyck Expressway, one of the early Dutch mayors in New York. So it was kind of kind of found myself amongst America's elite, or the kids thereof, or the grandchildren and great grandchildren thereof, and then had a great experience at Yale. Uh, you know, uh, Academically, socially, and ended up, getting a job out of college with Citibank, Citicorp Asia Capital Limited. Moved to Asia, was originally based for training in Hong Kong and Singapore, and then found my post in Vietnam, which was a very nostalgic place for me. My father had fought there. He was a Marine captain stationed on Hai Van Pass and recon. So I'd grown up kind of with his fatigues in the closet, and you know, at the end of the day, navigated my way to Vietnam from the region. It was just opening up over Doi Moi, so moved there in '96. Spent, you know, my formative kind of private equity and finance years there. Moving between Southeast Asian countries because they had an incredible rule that you had to renew your visa every 3 months. So Citibank would, as like a 22, 23-year-old, Citibank would send you, to Laos, Cambodia, basically any country that you wanted to travel to for 2 or 3 days. So had an incredible experience, in my early 20s. Got a lot of relevant experience being kind of, fairly senior just because of the, how out, how far of an outpost we were in Vietnam. We didn't get a lot of deals done. We did a lot of due diligence, but it was, I was there kind of ribbon cutting for the Hanoi branch and then the Ho Chi Minh branch, Saigon, formerly Saigon. Um, and then from there, just went out, started a technology company when I moved back after producing a documentary about Vietnam, in which we won the Emmy in 2000, which was a documentary about reconciliation between North Vietnamese soldiers and U.S. soldiers, primarily disabled in the Vietnam War, or the War of American Aggression, as they call it. So we did that. I moved back, started a technology company. The early 2000s, sold that in '04. I ended up, having some time on my hands, so volunteered for John Kerry's campaign in '04. Was a national finance co-chair, which was an exciting time, I think, to be in presidential politics because you could only raise $2,000 checks. So, you weren't competing with kind of the pack. So had kind of broadened my network through meeting a ton of people and bundling. I think it was referred to in the Post as a baby bundler at the time, which was good alliteration on the Post as they normally do. So that was an exciting time. Went out, realized I guess November. Give me the wrong, whatever the first Tuesday in November was, but realized after the election, I think it was the 4th, that I didn't have a job. So the idea was I was going to go into the White House. I'd done all the background stuff. Um, Ended up without a job, and so hung a shingle with one of my close friends from college, Chris Hines, Rosemont Capital, and then built Rosemont Capital. We started as a fundless sponsor, so looking at deals, raising capital around those deals, which is kind of a traditional onboarding or on ramp for establishing a boutique private equity company. We did that, had some success in the fundless sponsor space, and then eventually raised our first fund. Was a 2007 vintage, and then broadened into, we were a boutique but multi-asset class. We went from traditional private equity, co-investment. We did some ABS debt, and then we eventually got into real estate. Bought our real estate management company out of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and built the company to, at its peak, we were probably 3 billion in AUM, across asset class. The largest concentration was in real estate, commercial multi-tenant office. Bought that,
Okay.
started that May 10th. I know exact May 10th, 2010, and sold it August 31st, 2015. And then quick, I had 30 days of excitement, and I'd kind of invested in a number of companies, while we were in the sale process of Rosemont Realty, and one ended up being a absolute nightmare. But but we can talk more about that. But that's how I kind of got there, and then there was 10 years on the beach, and as of March 25th, my second birthday, I'm back out, back off the beach, and back in business, and
All right, so
great,
let's
great
go
to be
with
here.
well, let's talk about Christopher Hines.
Yes.
You were on the board of Burisma.
Yes.
You were the first on the
Yes.
board of Burisma versus Hunter Biden, right? So
Yes.
you got presumably the Hines is how you got to meet the Bidens, correct?
It's, I was in the it's often, kind of fuzzy reporting, but I met, Hunter initially, allegedly, I don't remember it, but he was at law school while I was at Yale. So I was undergrad at Yale while he was at law school. Allegedly, we'd met or shook hands at some point, but I can't really recall that interaction. But it's been reported, so it must be true. So I don't
Right.
we need someone to verify. But from there, 2000 at the in LA at the DNC, I was kind of in the Kerry posse and was moving around the skyboxes. Shook his hand at some point there. In '04 during the Kerry campaign, I was very involved, and met him again. And then in 2009, 2000, 2000, late 2008, 2009, an attorney of Hunter's actually introduced us for lunch, and Chris was not at that meeting. So there was obviously a relationship. Both their fathers were colleagues, but the direct kind of business interaction wasn't a direct introduction from Chris. It was by a mutual attorney friend of ours, just a New York attorney that was representing him in some things.
All right. So how
But
do
certainly, I
you
was
get on?
in the atmosphere.
How do you get on the Burisma board?
So how do I get on the Burisma board? So in probably 2012, and don't hold me to the exact date, so I'll keep it broad, but I have it all kind of outlined somewhere. But in 2012, we were heavily investing our time in raising capital for Rosemont Realty. And as you might recall, pre Maidan, pre Crimea, a lot of U.S. Asset managers, private equity funds, investors were looking and targeting Eastern European capital, right, for investment. And so we had hired a placement agent called Tri Global, which came from one of our fund formation attorneys, Greenberg Trauig, that had put us into a bake off, and we had I remember doing the presentation to these guys, Tri Global, who had other notable clients like Rudy Giuliani, which was interesting, and did a lot of his work in introducing him in the spheres of kind of Eastern Europe and Russia. And another notable client was the Romney family, so one of the Romney sons has a fund as well. So obviously they had a political, at the time we didn't know, but looking at their selection of clients, being a placement agent, they liked the political skew, and we fit squarely in there with a good investment product. So they went out, they put road shows together for us in Ukraine and Russia. We had some significant success in raising capital, not in Ukraine, also Kazakhstan, not in Ukraine, but in Russia, Eastern Europe, Georgia, and raised a significant amount of capital. One of the targets, so say we had 100 targets that Tri Global had was not Burisma, it was Zolshevsky. So Zolshevsky was a mini gark, I would say. He wasn't necessarily an oligarch, but he certainly had capital to invest. He came over to the States in 2012, and Tri Global showed him around. I actually was on another business trip, so I didn't end up meeting them, but we handed them the Rosemont Realty. It was called Rosemont Realty Acquisition Fund One pitch book at that time, and gave him that pitch book. And so that kind of just sat in there. He never invested. We had closed the fund. We're making acquisitions for some time, and then in 2014, I can tell you exactly the date here. March 3rd, 2013, I got a call to fly to Moscow to close a deal that we were working on for selling part of the GP, which would provide us. I don't want to get into kind of a tutorial on private equity, but we were selling some of the GP in order to create a pipeline of investment on the LP side. So we were selling it to a bank called B&N Bank. We'd worked for a year in due diligence. They visited all of our properties in 29 states, spent $1.5 million on due diligence with Price Waterhouse. And March 3rd, I get the call. I was in Miami, and they said, or March 2nd, I flew back to New York, flew over there to close the deal. And when I landed in Moscow to close this deal, there were, masked men. Remember looking at it was in the airport going through immigration. I saw, John Kerry was the Secretary of State at the time on television, and flashing two masked men in fatigues occupying Crimea. So I got in my car, and it was an overnight flight, drove directly to BNN Bank's headquarters in Moscow. Went up to the chairman and CEO's office, and we were watching the TV, and I was like, I guess the deal's off. So in more stereotypical fashion, they would have had a glass of vodka poured for us, but they poured two glasses of whiskey, and that deal was off. And so I'm there in Moscow. Don't know if World War III is breaking out. And one of the partners at Tri Global was like, "Oh, there's a Ukrainian here in Moscow today too. He's a guy that's looked at your deck. He might be an investor." So I made my way over to the Hyatt at I remember the Hyatt rooftop in Moscow at sunset, and met Zlochevsky in person for the first time. Now he had been kind of I wouldn't say he'd been aware of Rosemont for 2 years now, Rosemont Realty for 2 years now. He'd looked at it, considered the investment, and we sat there and had I had my pitch book. I went through it, and there was um, now I know there was an alternate agenda, but I did my pitch, laid it all out, and then he had mentioned in that meeting, he said, and he was quick acting. He said, my board, Alexander Kwasniewski, the president of Poland, is on my board. And I said, oh, that's so interesting, congratulations. And we continued, we had cappuccinos, I remember, espressos, and we left, and he said, right before he left, he said, do you mind if my corporate secretary, Vadim Pojarski, stays in contact with you? We might follow up on Roosevelt Realty, where there might be other business. And remember, Alexander Kwasniewski joined my board. I said, oh, what an honor! That's amazing. I'd love to meet him. And that's on a Monday or Tuesday of that week. I think it was Monday. And I leave and start getting WhatsApps from Vadim, and he says, Alexander Kwasniewski wants to meet you. I fly to Lithuania. I fly back to Moscow later in that week. We have dinner, and eventually they arrange for me to fly to Warsaw the next week. I land there, and Alexander said, I'm the president. I was the former president of Poland. I'm, great friends of the Atlantic Council and great friends of Biden. It would be an honor. Would you like to join the board?" And so the question, the ask happens that second week of March in Warsaw, and then the executive kind of team of baristas there. So I said, yeah, that would be interesting. We met later in the afternoon, and I negotiated a deal, and was basically like, I need to um, review due diligence. We've got to hire attorneys, and they provided me with a Kroll report. I was basically talking to Kwasniewski on how did you get comfortable with these guys? He said we commissioned this Kroll report. We went through that, and I said, yeah, it sounds very interesting. The offer was made, and probably the end of the next week, I said, if we hire Boy Schiller, and they kind of outsource a report, I'd be open to doing this, um, and that was, the rest was history. What could go wrong?
Right. So, but your friend Chris Hines, I understand, turned down a position on the board as well over what? Why did he do that?
No, Chris was never proposed
Oh,
the board seat nor interested.
all right. So
Well, I think
that
just generally because he didn't need the money.
well, yeah, that would make some sense. So how does Hunter show up there, and were you communicating with him before he gets on the board?
Yeah, I was in. Hunter was an advisor to Rosemont Realty. Helped us, on the margins and some of the capital raising. But I hired Boyd Schiller to do a comprehensive due diligence, really, for Kwasniewski and myself. And Hunter was of counsel at Boyd Schiller, so he developed a relationship. The idea was to hire Boyd Schiller as as both a representative in the United States for the company. It was part of a condition of me joining the board. And so he was of counsel. He later developed a relationship, fairly quickly in the next couple of months, and then joined the board in May, I believe. But that was outside of my, kind of management.
So you're sitting on the board with Hunter Biden. This and Joe Biden is vice president at the time, right?
Yes.
Or had all right. So did that seem odd to you in a sense that he would be involved with Ukraine, which is at the center of international politics?
It was, yes, I think I had a sense of, I had a sense of, the what could go wrong, really percolated in my psyche after he was asked by Kwasniewski to join the board as a, as a counselor to the company. I didn't see anything as a big headline risk, but that ask happened, later in May in Lake Como, and I think Hunter was, interested in the economics. I think he did have probably had some, altruistic ideas that Ukraine needed energy independence, and they were kind of selling that very hard. But at the time, it was I didn't realize, that it was going to be, the board ask was very quick, and he was highly motivated. He had his brother was sick. He needed, if you remember at the time, Obama said, Joe, don't sell your house. There was, money issues there. Joe had not written the books yet, so I think there was, uh, I think that it was, it was something that happened very quickly, and yeah, the radar went off, and then certainly when the news stories started popping up, it was the most Googled news story when some announcement was made later in that summer, I believe.
So did you uh, go to Ukraine as a board member? Did you participate a lot? Did Hunter apparently didn't seem to do that? What did that deepen your concerns?
Yeah, well, I was yeah, I was in Ukraine early, early in my tenure. So I probably went to a board meeting, not it wasn't an official board meeting, but a meeting with Kwasniewski in Kiev, in the outskirts of Kiev. I'd been going there fairly often just to raise capital, which was unsuccessful for Rosemont Realty. But probably at 2 meetings there. Hunter never went to Ukraine, but he attended all of the board meetings. We'd have quarterly board meetings. The first one was in Paris, the second in Dubai. There was one in Cyprus. So I was a regular participant. Hunter did join the board meetings. I was responsible initially for raising outside capital for expansion, and then when Hunter joined the board, which I don't think that they anticipated, the political risk meter went way up, and outside capital became kind of a unattainable. So I focused my efforts on international expansion. So we ended up opening up Burisma Eurasia. We opened up Burisma Geothermal. So I was kind of moved my focus once it became, untenable to raise outside capital because of the, PEP exposure of Hunter to expansion. We were very successful. We were successful in Burisma Eurasia. Geothermal did not really, we were successful in getting licenses. We didn't end up drilling because we didn't get out of the ground because I was unfortunately targeted and and taken out of commission by the powers that be here in America.
Okay, so that we're getting close to the really important question that I would like to ask. But tell us, at the moment that Biden, goes over there, wants the firing of the prosecutor, how did that? What was that experience?
Yeah, so that experience was, that's, some time has passed. The 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 popular narrative that we were fed at the time was that Shokin was taken care of. As I look back with 2020 vision, I think that was a narrative that was very important to feed to me, the useful idiot in this situation. Because I think at the end, I think that when I look back at it, I do believe that there was pressure from Shokin on Burisma. I believe that he was, it was very convenient to have him fired, and then that pressure relieved because Burisma ended up, lasting another, 5 or 6 years. I think they didn't ever dissolve. It's just in a number of other holding companies now. So for uh, you know, for all intents and purposes, it's still around, but just under, different names and shell ownership, but they're still drilling. And, without having cleared Shokin out of the way or, bringing Kwasniewski and Hunter on board, I don't think they would have made it through that decade.
All right, so I'm glad we've gone through this portion of it because the kid from Glenhead, through a lot of initiative and meeting the right people, you've gone from a lacrosse player of some renown. I mean, if you got a record on Long Island, I'm going to stick with you.
Yeah.
And
It's
there
there.
you are. Now you're doing deals with the Bidens involved and all of that. I won't get deep into that because the real question is, there you were watching Hunter Biden, and to
Yeah.
me, he felt invulnerable.
Yes.
And so what was that like to watch that? Because for the average American, they believe that government is non-responsive to them. It is this playground for the rich, famous, and powerful, and that they don't get held accountable. What was your sense then and your sense now?
Well, I think there's, just physically, it was it was a very unique situation to be in, to be traveling, on business trips with Secret Service. So there was beyond the kind of the other pressures that be in the world in business, in kind of the legal frameworks, just the actual physical presence of traveling in the bubble, and having, presidential Secret Service, or vice presidential Secret Service around you, made you, certainly gives you a sense of invulnerability. And that was the first sense of it, which was fairly unique. It obviously is to use the term my 10-year-old, it's certainly a flex, going into a business meeting when the Secret Service is clearing the room. Um, and yeah, there was definitely a feeling of invulnerability, and you know, it was working for a while until it didn't.
Everyone, we're going to take a quick break and come back to our interview with Devon Archer. Welcome back, everyone, to Politics and Perspective. My guest this week is Devon Archer, who had a unique position in life. So, Devon, let's get right back into it. We have about 12 minutes here,
Right.
so we're going to get a little bit more rapid fire. So, there you are, doing business deals with the Bidens. You've
Hmm.
said nationally, it was the Biden brand that opened doors and closed deals, right?
Hmm. Absolutely.
All right. So, and there's an invulnerability there. So, at this time, surely the FBI, this is my commentary, and the DOJ knew what was going on. We just saw, if we can put up the article related to the NY Post. Well, here, I wrote this in 2022. And what I wrote in 2022 is, which you can see,
Hmm.
is that the DOJ and the FBI want to decide who can be president of the United States. At least that's my view. And the sense was they were going after Trump, they weren't going after the Bidens. Recently, there was a New York Post article by Miranda Devine talking about the FBI a gag order on information related to the Hunter Biden laptop, which they had during this period of time. So the big question for me is what was it like being around this, seeing it even in retrospect, and did you know that there was this sort of dynamic going on where, as I
Hmm.
say in my book, The Lesson of American Civilization and Elsewhere, that those in power in Washington were protecting themselves from the voters, from the prospect of Trump coming in and upsetting their party, and all of that?
Hmm. Well, again, I think at the time, I certainly didn't anticipate how things, unfolded. I definitely had a sense, in all of my interactions and all of the time, in DC and, dealing with the Biden brand and being one of the salespeople of that brand, that that there was some veneer of protection, obviously, because you could, call different people that they had relationships with. You had access to, folks could help folks with visas and this and that and the other thing. But personally, I always felt a little bit, on the outside. I think the insiders that were lifers were a little bit resentful, that I got every Christmas, White House, the White or the Naval Observatory, Christmas invites and the Easter egg roll invites, and that I had this unique access because you know, um, I was, profiting for the family. So I think I felt, just personally, it was interesting. It was an incredible novelty to, to travel in the bubble, to have that Secret Service person. It was certainly helpful for us. But I always felt a little. I felt a slight veneer of being an outsider. So I never felt completely protected. And I think that spider sense, ended up, manifesting in a 10-year battle with the machine.
And so what, and that machine, so did you have a look over your shoulder sense as the years went on? Did you, I mean, when
Yeah.
uh, I've been in and around Washington, my family has, I, there's, I don't think there's ever a feeling of comfort for
Right.
the average person. So what, when you put your head on the pillow, and where are you as the Hunter and the Biden things are unfolding, and what happened to you in your fight?
Right. So, and as a an average person, I think that your feeling, is very much of my feeling. I mean, I think there was, again, there was a sense of physical protection, but what happened was, because there is so much spotlight, on the Bidens, obviously being in that position of power in the brand, when Hunter had some activity that was, that was targeted by whistleblower at Morgan Stanley. There was several, SARS, which are suspicious activity reports that, were dinged at Morgan Stanley, for activity in an account called RSB, that he was the corporate secretary of, and that we controlled through the COO of the company. And so that scrutiny, that light was always shining on him. That activity presented itself. Morgan Stanley whistleblower, who I've met subsequently and has apologized for the hell he's put me through, even though it had no bearing on that. He was simply blowing the whistle on SARS activity of Hunter, and um, and I don't know the details of that activity, but what happened is he looked into that account, and there was, it was kind of like peeling back an onion. There was a company that I was chairman of, as we were exiting Rosemont Realty for that sale that I'd kind of detailed earlier. We had acquired 51% of a investment bank. Actually, interestingly enough, the investment bank was the investment bank, that Michael Milken originally brought down. So lightning struck twice for Burnham. And so in that investment bank, there were, they would run through 100 deals a quarter or whatever, and the onion was being pulled back, and there was activity that was, associated with one particular deal. We were not on the investment committee, so Hunter was not guilty of as was I, guilty of any of this these allegations. But interestingly enough, he didn't. He was, though the original whistleblower, he was not brought up or brought into the spotlight and officially charged. I was originally, a witness. I became a subject and then a target in a very short order on a whistleblower allegation for a particular fraud that actually was a fraud. There were some people who stole some money amongst a much bigger organization, and they were
So,
subsequently prosecuted. So he was kind of insulated. He was the original target of this whistleblower. I was a another innocent participant, but he was a little bit too big to fail, and they quickly put the spotlight on me, who was expendable, an average kid from North Shore High School, right next to Glen Cove. He said, "Okay, this guy's big enough that we can still get the value of this investigation that we're investing all this money in, and we can, take down a name that makes this case actually valuable." It's interesting. There's a quote. He's quoted very often. He's a CNN commentator named Preet Bharara, who was he was the AG at or not the he was yeah he was he was running the Southern District at the time, and he often goes on CNN. He says, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to see it, does it make a sound? And this was very much one of those cases. It's like, okay, Hunter was interesting. We're going to put a big spotlight in this. Wait, he's too big to fail. So let's find someone that has some, association with this case. So at least we can get articles in the Post, and the Times, and the Journal, and it can, propel our AUSA's career to get better jobs at, the Boy Schillers that defended me, and the whatever the Aiken Gumps and all the same guys. So it's like this the whole system is, in these political persecutions and political adjacent cases. It's really resume building for the prosecutors that sit at these various districts. So I have the utmost respect for our Justice Department. I it's one of the most important one of the most important apparatus of our government, and it keeps us safe. It allows us to flourish. It allows a average kid from North Shore High School who's got a good lacrosse shot, to make it into kind of um, the glitterati of the business world. But at the same time, you know, busting a murder or busting a drug case or what have you doesn't get you, a nine-figure contract at one of the big civil or criminal white collar defenders. You need your currency in going through those prosecutors' offices is black ink, right? You're not making much money. You're sacrificing after law school, but you're spending 5 years. You're spending 10 years. And then you're, hired in as an associate or associate partner, and making millions of dollars a year for the rest of your life. And so it's kind of like your SDNY run is kind of like your residency for med school when doctors used to be compensated fairly.
all right. So, where does this leave us all? We got like about a minute and a half left.
Yeah. So where
You
does
you
this lead?
became an expendable. You were
Absolutely. Yeah.
inside the bubble. They're going after Trump. They want to hold their power. Andrew Weissman wants the black ink.
Yep.
How does America get out of this?
So I think America gets out of this by just rereading the fundamentals of what the Justice Department was built on. I think the first sentence or two of it, quickly after 1776, the Justice Department is established, and it's about a pursuit of justice. The idea is that it's not about putting up W's, putting up wins. It's about pursuing justice, which is really what the bylaws of that organization are. And I think it's become muted through people following their wallets, right? They're looking to have the most exposure in their, I would say, legal residency in these kind of, these prosecutors' offices. I think I think it has to be a look back, and they have to get into those offices and say, listen, this is what we're about. We're about finding truth. And exposing politically adjacent people with, there's global corruption and selective enforcement, and finding these and getting a headline is not what, not that's not the goal here. It's about, you know looking back at what this organization was built on, the principles that it was built on, um, and readdressing it. I think that's really what has to happen in the Department of Justice. I think Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, I think they have their heads on in the right place. They saw how dangerously close we got with President Trump and the the apparatus taking him down. I mean, they tried to kill him, they tried to arrest him, they tried to jail him. I only had a small exposure to how dark those forces are, and hopefully, under this new leadership, we'll be in a position where things will change. It's going to take a while, but we have the leadership that can start the process.
Devon, thanks so much for coming on. Hopefully, your lacrosse career leads you in a better direction than all you went through. But I appreciate you spending time today, and especially to our viewers. Join us on Rumble, YouTube, Patriot.tv, AUN TV, and thanks to our sponsor, politicalvanguard.com. We'll see you next week.